Welcome to the webinar this afternoon. I'm Greg Burke. I'm the Director of Place and Civic Engagement based at Sheffield Hallam University, and we lead the Civic University Network on behalf of other universities. Just to say a little bit about the Civic University Network before we go into the event today, for those of you who are less familiar with the Civic University Network, we are a network that's been in existence now for just over 2 years. Our aim is really to capture and to share what's going on around the civic agenda across the sector, across different universities, very much with the overall objective of improving the impact that we as universities have on places, recognising this is a really broad agenda, and the more we can share, the more we can learn from one another, the more we can really improve the impact that we have. Today's session is particularly interesting because it's around how do we get students involved in the civic agenda. And this is, I think, a really untapped area where there's so much more that we can do. And obviously our student bodies are huge. And if we can really release the power of the student body, we can achieve so much more in the civic space than if we just do things through staff or through other aspects. So this is, I think, a really exciting area that we're just starting to unpack as the Civic University Network. Just before we go into the session, there's a few housekeeping issues that I just wanted to cover. The session today will be recorded and will be made available. So if you want to access it after the event or share it with others, that is absolutely possible. If you have questions for the panel section of the event later, please put them in the Q&A section rather than the chat. Please use the chat to share information, to share things that are not questions. But if you can focus your questions in the Q&A. Don't worry if you get it wrong. Our technical team will be checking the chat function and make sure that any questions do get moved into the Q&A. But obviously, if you can put them there, that makes it a lot easier. I will now pass over to Richard Brabner from the UPP Foundation, who is going to introduce the session and is going to chair the Q&A during the latter part of the session. So over to you, Richard.
Thanks, Greg, and hello everybody. Great to be here, and we're really pleased to be sharing the insights, the early insights from the University of Exeter's sort of university-led tutoring project. As a foundation, we absolutely love university-led tutoring and tutoring projects more widely. In the past, we've had partnerships with a charity called Get Further, which does a tutoring project with FE colleges, and we know the power of small group tutoring has a big impact in terms of raising attainment. The Civic University Commission, when we ran that in 2018, 2019, when we did the focus groups and the polling, utilising the resources of universities to support raising attainment in their local communities was the one thing that was the sort of main focus of the local public, both in terms of the focus groups we ran and the polling, and that sort of has been replicated in polling that we've done since then too. And it's also obviously transforms the student experience. We know from the Student Futures Commission that we recently ran that there are inequalities in terms of the experience the students get, the sort of immersive elements of that student experience. So we know that we need to embed some of that within the curriculum so they can gain social capital, reduce loneliness and support well-being too. So as Lee, I'm sure, is going to talk to in a moment, this is a win-win, but also a win for local communities too. So it's a real win-win-win in developing these models. This project, the University of Exeter's tutoring project, is one of our 8 current grants that we're funding. It's already making a transformative impact on the people that it's actually supporting, and we're really pleased to be sharing some of the early insights from it today. So in terms of today's agenda, we're going to hear from Lee Elliot Major, Professor of Social Mobility at Exeter, and Anne-Marie Sim, who has been the key researcher on this project, to talk you through this scheme and the insights from this scheme. And then we're going to have a panel with Leah, Anne-Marie, and then Lindsay Skinner from St James School, Exeter, who helped co-create this particular university-led tutoring scheme. So without further ado, I'm now going to hand over to Lee.
Thank you very much, Richard. Pleasure to be here, everyone. I'm just going to say a few words just about the motivations for this programme, and then hand it over to my brilliant colleague, Anne-Marie, who will talk a bit more about the detail and how we've implemented this. Tutoring was one of these things. I always think of it as having sort of special powers in education. I've done a lot of work over my career looking at what education approaches, what school approaches work best for disadvantaged pupils. And tutoring, because it's targeted and because it's potentially very powerful, is one of the few things we know in the school sphere that can really help those pupils catch up that have fallen behind. So this idea of using undergraduates really came from those dark days of the early pandemic when the government was looking for ideas of levelling up. Do you remember that phrase? So I think that's the first thing I would say, is that people sometimes forget that it has a kind of particular power in terms of helping disadvantaged pupils. So we came from that perspective. But what has happened, and our work with Richard and colleagues, I think, has really helped develop this, is that, as Richard was saying, I call this the win-win-win programme. And so we're seeing this as a benefit, not just for those pupils that have fallen behind in the pandemic in schools, but also it benefits undergraduates, right? So what we find in even this small pilot is the undergraduates really get sort of skills from doing this tutoring, this weekly tutoring session. They also, as Anne-Marie will explain, get a credit towards their degree in one of the models we're using, which I think is really, really important. So I hope this really does contribute to the university's civic role. I think other things I'd say just before I hand over to Anne-Marie, just for everyone to sort of understand what we see as the benefits of this. I think the first is quality, right? So there's a lot of tutoring that goes on in our country and other countries. There's huge variation in actual quality. And so we've thought really hard, and we work with Lindsay really closely on this. How do we ensure that this will be good quality tutoring? So that's first point. Second point, sustainability. We think that because it's embedded in a university, universities are going to be around for a long time, right? So we think if we can get this right, this should be working, in 10 years' time in universities. And indeed, we're really attracted to some of the things, again, discussed with Richard about service, the idea of service learning, which has been very much looked at in the United States, where students automatically do something like this for the greater good as part of their degrees. I would like to see that happen more in this country. So it's sustainable, it's part of the education system. And then finally, it's scalable, right? So we do have universities and colleges across the country. And one of the issues for helping pupils across the country, as many of you will know, is getting to those pupils at different parts of the country. So listen, I'm not going to sell it anymore, but those are some of the ideas that prompted us to develop this very exciting pilot. I'm going to hand it over to Anne-Marie now to tell you a bit more about the detail. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Lee. So as Lee said, we think this is a model for a university-led tutoring service that can provide high-quality, sustainable tutoring for less advantaged school students. I'm going to talk about the key elements of the programme, what we think are the particular benefits of this programme, and then how we've been taking this work forward. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. Oh, just one back. Thanks. So what is the University of Exeter tutoring programme? It's a 9-week foundational literacy course for Year 8s who are struggling with writing accurate sentences on a consistent basis. And because this underpins really all subjects, we think addressing this before children start their GCSE years is absolutely vital. It's delivered by undergraduates at Exeter studying any subject. and students undertake the tutoring placement as part of an accredited module, which I'll go into a little bit more detail on in just a moment. And the course has been written by Lindsay, who's going to be joining us in the panel discussion in a moment, who's a current head teacher in Exeter, and it's based on her book that's used by over 1/3 of secondary schools already. And it comes fully specified with all of the content, so all of the lesson PowerPoints, the pupil course booklets, and the tutor training. And the training consists of 5 hours of online lectures, which students are given 10 hours to complete. So to watch the videos, to pause, to practice, and so on. And next slide, please. So I'll explain a little bit more about the module, which is called Learning for Teaching. This was an existing module at Exeter, and it offers a taster in teaching to any 2nd, 3rd and 4th year undergraduate students. So the majority of students who take this course have an interest, either strong or vague, in potentially doing teaching as a possible career. And essentially what we've done is we've sort of piggybacked onto this existing module by offering the tutoring as one possible placement option. So before the tutoring, the students had to do a placement, which was a self-organised 2-week school placement that they did usually in September before the start of the university term. During COVID, they had the option of doing a virtual placement, and then we've added the tutoring placement now. And this is a compulsory placement as part of the module. So in our pilot, students spent every Wednesday afternoon in autumn term at St James School, Lindsay's school, in Exeter, observing afternoon lessons, so for about an hour and a half, and then they tutored the same 2 to 3 pupils after school every week for an hour. And so that was a 9-week course, that was 9 weeks over the course of the autumn term. And the placement had 50 hours allocated to it, which, as you can sort of see, that's quite a big time allocation for the actual tutoring that went on. But that involved a substantial amount dedicated to training, as I mentioned, including in the first week, students coming in and getting to meet Lindsay and ask questions and so on. Then 9 hours of preparation time, so an hour each week to prepare for the upcoming lesson. And then an hour to reflect as well on that week's tutoring and also the observation session that they took part in. And the students then had to write a reflective log, which is an assessed part of the module. And we've been really fortunate enough to read some of those reflective logs. And I think it's, it's been really inspiring seeing the amount of work that the students put in, as well as the sort of the real benefit and inspiration that they got from doing the placement. Next slide, please. So I'll talk you through the benefits of the programme. As I say, we ran this trial in autumn term of this year, and there were really, really positive results from this. We saw 100% improvement in a post-tutoring assessment, which the pupils undertook. We're also collecting evaluation results from further trials, and we're partnering with Impact Ed to make sure that our evaluation design is really robust for future data collection. As I said, we think this is a model for high quality, scalable, affordable and sustainable tutoring. And I'm just going to talk through each of those elements one by one. So in terms of quality, I think there's a number of elements involved in this. The first one is tutor attendance and engagement. We've seen sort of, I guess, we saw some problems with the national tutoring programme in terms of tutor attendance sometimes. Because this is part of an assessed module, I think all of the undergraduate students were very engaged, and we could see this in terms of their attendance and in terms of their reflective logs in terms of the time and effort that they put into the tutoring. Secondly, the high proportion of training and preparation time built in, as I talked about. Thirdly, it being a fully specified course, which, as Lindsay will tell you, really reduces the variability between tutors and the need for tutors to rely on their own learning experiences in their teaching. And then fourthly, as Lee mentioned, we think it's a really high quality experience for the undergraduates as well. So the feedback we've had from them has been really positive, and it's clear from their reflective logs how much they've learned and how much they've gained from the placement, including whether or not teaching is actually for them. And I think, as Lindsay's nodding there, as Lindsay will tell you as well, that's such a valuable lesson and such a good outcome in and of itself, we think. It's also, of course, beneficial to the students in terms of employability. The scalable element, so the course materials and the online training can be shared and scaled really easily. And this was one of the considerations that we had when we thought about whether to do the training face-to-face or online. And we went with online because we felt that this would make it really, really scalable. Affordability, of course, tutoring can be a high-cost intervention, and the module route means that it can be delivered, with a relatively small resource from both the university side in terms of organisation and then the school side as well, some organisation there. But of course, the students themselves aren't being paid individually for this. And then also there's an affordability aspect that's tied to the quality. So the training provision is a lot more than would be possible if we were using a paid route. And then finally, in terms of sustainability, as Lee said, universities are here for the long term, we hope. They're anchor institutions in their local areas or regions. And we think that this is a real opportunity to embed tutoring for the longer term, and specifically through the module as well. Although it takes some time and effort to set up, we think that module route means that it's more likely for the tutoring to really be embedded for the longer term. Finally, as well, it's also accessible to all students, being embedded within the curriculum rather than being, for example, a volunteering or even a paid opportunity. Next slide, please. So how have we been taking this work forward? Well, we'll be running the module again next year. We're also trialling a different model, partnering with Next Step Southwest, who are the UniConnect partner for the Southwest region. And that's with Plymouth undergraduates in a Plymouth school. And we've been getting really useful feedback on running the same course, but in a different context. That is with a different delivery model though. So that's through paid student ambassadors. So some of the things that I talked about in terms of the module delivery don't apply there. We've also been talking with lots of other universities and UniConnect partners who are interested in the approach. I think universities are particularly interested in the module delivery, and we've been sharing some of those experiences with them. And UniConnect partners are interested in this paid student ambassador route. And we think it's a really good means of achieving a sort of quick scale up, especially because setting up the module can be quite time consuming to get going. So we're looking at potentially 6 or 7 universities or UniConnect partners interested in running the programme next year. And finally, we've also published a report that talks about this model and goes through the key considerations that we think universities need to think about when doing this work. So it's not necessarily saying that this is, this is definitely not, the only model. We think there's room for any number of models, but this is just, this talks about some of the things that universities will need to think about in terms of implementation, which we think is, really the key thing here. So that's all. Thanks very much.
Brilliant, thank you, Anne-Marie. I hope that was really fascinating, and I'm sure participants that are both here live and get to see this afterwards will really really value those contributions, particularly when they're thinking about setting up their own university-led tutoring schemes. Now, before we get to the Q&A, as we have Lindsay here, who's the head teacher, obviously, who's helped co-create this particular project, I think it would be really useful, Lindsay, to hear your sort of reflections from the school side in what works, where things need to be developed further, how what are the sort of pitfalls for university when they're thinking about this, what are the things that they need to consider when developing a sort of really embedded relationship with the school to get this off the ground.
Sure. So it began with Lee approaching me and asking me if I firstly want to be involved in the project from a head teacher perspective, as in, do you want your children to be tutored for free? Oh, yeah, okay, yeah, well, you sold me. And then also him saying, well, would you mind having a look and creating some of the content for it? And, what do you think we should focus on? And I'd already had the National Tutoring Programme in my school. I was really sold on the idea, and the research clearly indicates that, of course, small group tutoring is beneficial to children, particularly those who are disadvantaged, and can close the achievement gap. But as you'll know, government policy means that that's becoming more and more costly for schools and more difficult in terms of that cost matching to kind of fit into your budget. And so the idea that there might be a self-sustaining model where we could use undergraduates for community good to support our most disadvantaged children, for me, it's like the absolute dream. So I was really sold on that. And I think in that way, for me, it was better than the NTP in terms of affordability from a head teacher's perspective. And then, of course, there was the issue. Now, the National Tutoring Programme varied in quality, and both Lee and Anne-Marie have already talked about quality. For me, what was important is that we identified very specifically what it was that we thought that certain children weren't able to do, particularly those who are more disadvantaged were often not able to do, and how that impacted on progress across the curriculum. And there are a few of things, like reading fluency is one, but writing fluency and accuracy particularly they are two really big things across the curriculum. And my area of love is sentences, so I was like, well, let's focus on the writing one for the time being. So from my perspective, we then, we created the resources. And in terms of relationship with the university, it was pretty straightforward, I have to say, from a head teacher perspective. So we needed a member of staff who liaised with the university and met the young undergraduates and made sure that they were in lessons to shadow. We needed laptops for them, or Chromebooks, and they'd already done all of the learning. We simply needed to print out the resources, and basically we were ready to go. So in terms of liaising with the university, there were only a few basic things that needed to happen, like obviously safeguarding checks, making sure that the organizational bit was there in terms of when people were coming in, but it was pretty straightforward from a school perspective. And the impact, I mean, it has been enormous. So I've mentioned that the impact of writing across the curriculum is big, but like this 100% increase in terms of descriptor for the assessment, and that took children from sometimes using the forms of accuracy, so that might be full stops or it might be multiple sentences or whatever, sometimes using them mostly inaccurately through to often using them mostly accurately. I mean, that's a significant shift, particularly for children who are already in year 8, which means they haven't been able to do it previously. These are kids who are 12 and 13 years old. And what's been lovely to see off the back of that is the way that their confidence has bloomed. They still talk to me about this trial now, even though it was right at the very beginning of the year, and they're really enthused about it. And the feedback from the teachers has been that they have appeared more confident in lessons, much more likely to contribute both verbally and in terms of their written contributions. And that for me shows that it isn't just about that they've just improved the ability to write sentences, which although I think is crucial, I think it has to be, any kind of tutoring program has to be about a bigger impact than that. And it clearly has had that on their ability to write across the curriculum and their confidence. And the feedback from teachers across the board has absolutely supported that. And the student surveys did the same thing. But one thing that has been an unexpected surprise to me, because I just hadn't considered it, was how much the children would look up, and it's obvious when you think about it, but I hadn't thought about it, how much they would look up to the undergraduates. And they loved them, thought they were marvelous, and so many of our children now are speaking about wanting to go to university, and not all of them had that aspiration before, or indeed they might have had that aspiration but not thought it was possible, and now they really feel like it could be possible. And that for me is been quite an exciting thing. And then the aim is to repeat again next year. And so in terms of like from the university perspective, I think if they've just got one key contact for the school, real clarity about when they're going to be visiting, and the resources are already there ready to go, it's pretty straightforward in terms of running. But yeah, it's been enormously positive.
Brilliant, thank you. And how have you seen, has there been a legacy to it? So obviously it's a 1 term, a 9-week course. So does the sort of the benefits from it continue over a period of time that you've seen so far?
And I think that is important about the assessment, actually. So the assessment was done a couple of months after they'd finished the course, deliberately, right? Because like if you teach someone something, the forgetting curve in and of itself will show you that if you test immediately afterwards, they're going to be able to do it. But if you leave it and then test and they can still do it, that's where you really see the impact. And that's what we're seeing, that not only are they able to remember how to write accurately, they have a cognizance about that they're writing that they never had before, but that they are also now doing that across a range of subjects. And I guess, like, I knew that this methodology worked from my own teaching. Like, you know, you teach for however long in a classroom and you begin to know what works. But I'd only ever really known it from my perspective. And then obviously I wrote the Burke Crafting Brilliant Sentences, and that is used across many secondary schools, and lots of feedback from that saying it worked. But it has been really nice to do it like an independent university-led piece of research that has just shown this pedagogy does work with children and it works for the long term. And of course, that changes their ability to access the curriculum. That I think is a real gift. Like, if that's a forever gift for a child, if they can write accurately. And so, yeah, I mean, it's exciting, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. Thank you. Before we get to the questions, Anne-Marie, I know you obviously delved into this in your presentation, but for the universities present, what would you say the key building blocks for developing this, or the points that they really need to consider if they want to set up their own tutoring scheme?
Yeah, I think the first thing is what the university is already doing. I think every university is doing an absolute load of things, and actually sometimes getting to the bottom of what exactly is happening can be a sort of a task in itself. You know, there'll be things happening within widening participation, within employability. There'll also be things happening in departments and faculties and so on. But a really important thing is just, first of all, kind of knowing things that are already going on, existing relationships with schools. And of course, you know, the reason for this is, I mean, firstly, you know, there's obviously no point in sort of doing something that's already being done. And secondly, as well, you know, as happened with our module, you know, jumping on the back of something that already happens makes things so much easier and so much quicker. So that's one thing. I think the second thing to note is just the amount of time that it can take to set some of these things up. You know, we're looking at sort of, if you're looking to run something in, for example, autumn term, you're potentially planning, you know, a year or two in advance, and that's something that needs to be borne in mind. And I think the third thing would be getting the buy-in from various people in the university is really important. So in terms of what we did with the module, of course, there's the module leads involved, but there's also sort of people within the university involved in, for example, sort of academic leads, the sort of the overall kind of strategy of the university and so on, and actually having all of these conversations and knowing that they'll take time to kind of work through, and factoring that time in is, again, really important.
So building on existing relationships, building in the amount of time, the lead-in time that you need to do this, and then obviously that really important internal engagement piece across the university to get buy-in. And where from the university? I presume the senior leadership team of the university, the Department for Education, if you've got a School of Education or whatever within the university, is going to be critical. Are there any other aspects of the institution that you think is really important to get buy-in to develop this? And
then WP and employability, also very helpful. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, just to add to that, Richard, I think these are good questions because we're quite unusual in that I have relationships with the Vice Chancellor, the faculty head, the School of Education, the head of WP. I'm on the TED Rag Trust, which Lindsay's school's part of. So I think we were fortunate, and we were fortunate to have Lindsay, by the way, on our doorstep, because it almost, I've started to believe in God again. It's like we managed to get the teacher who had written this book. So we were very lucky, I think, in some ways. But and we might get into this. I think absolutely writing sentences is one. I think it's a foundational skill, as Lindsay very articulately sort of spoke about. I think possibly if this worked, we could develop reading an equivalent scheme for reading fluency, and maybe even look at some basic maths skills. But that's why we focused on that area. But yeah, I think we were quite fortunate to have those relationships in place.
Very good. So there's a first question here, which is obviously about how do you ensure engagement of undergraduate tutors is high and maintained through the programme. Now, obviously, you've essentially answered that by embedding it within the curriculum. But I suppose a sort of subsequent is that was the engagement or the motivation continued across the term for the tutors? How do you ensure that because if something goes wrong in this in a project like that, could be really detrimental, right, to the school pupils. So I suppose a risk for all universities thinking about this is how their students are going to behave in developing this. This isn't a typical module for them. And are there, if there's a university there that is hesitant about embedding it within the curriculum around assessment because they just can't do that at the moment, are there any ways that they could do that would sort of mitigate that risk? I don't know, Lee or Emery.
I'll let Anne-Marie come on to this, Richard, but I just to add, and I'm sure Lindsay would say this too, it's so fundamental, this, because what you don't want for these pupils is another adult to not fulfill their commitment, right? Honestly, it would be hugely detrimental if you start off a commitment and then you don't fulfill it, i.e. the undergraduates. So I think it's so fundamental. But anyway, Anne-Marie, you might want to say a bit about that.
Yeah, sure. It was something we were really conscious of. And so a few of the things we did were, first of all, we built in a couple of sort of meeting, scheduled meetings with the undergraduates. To be honest, the attendance, we made it voluntary because, it's not sort of an extra thing that we think they have to do, but we put in sort of touch points where if they had any concerns, if they were worried about anything, they could come meet us and talk about it. To be honest, we had a couple of students come to the first one and no interest in the second one, which I think, was largely because everything was going fine, but there was that opportunity built in case there was anything that they wanted to talk about. And I was the person doing the coordinating, liaising with the students, and so I would sort of check in by email to find out if any of them just wanted to meet to discuss anything. And then, of course, we were also really fortunate to have Lindsay coordinating this on the school side. And I think that relationship with the school is really important because, of course, the school is in a sense is the first sort of point of alert, really. If anything isn't going well with the students, I think the school will be the first people, I suppose, to notice that and to be able to let us know if there's any concerns.
And actually on that, I think when I first met the undergraduates for my kind of first introductory session when they got to ask questions, they were clearly very nervous. They had a lot of questions like, what do I do if they're naughty? Or, oh, what do I do if they ask me a question that I don't know the answer to? And what became apparent very quickly to both me and them is that because the programme is set up so that it creates success very quickly, that the children were really on board. And then actually what I found is a palpable relief amongst all the undergraduates after the first session, a kind of quiet excitement for the next one. And by the third session, they were bringing in stickers. And by the fourth session, it was like 3D stickers and shiny stickers. And they had found a love for it because there was something really beautiful for them to watch children in their care flourish. And I think that actually, in a way, the programme in and of itself created engagement for the undergraduates.
Brilliant, thank you. There's a sort of a sort of follow-on question here that has just come in around, was there any selection through applications or interviews for the undergraduate students before they were able to tutor? So I suppose how were they selected?
Yeah, so they weren't selected. This was undergraduates who had signed up to the Learning for Teaching module. So as I mentioned, these are students who I guess had an interest in teaching as a possible career. So I would say that, and definitely this came through from their reflective logs, you know, they had a real interest in teaching and in working with pupils. So no selection on that basis. And then in terms of subject, as I said, it was students taking any undergraduate subject. And I guess the thing to note about the course and the training is that it is written so that students from any background, so they don't have to be studying English, can teach the course from scratch without sort of knowing having any prior background knowledge.
And that's a key point, isn't it? Because around that scalability piece that you were talking about earlier, because I'm sure there must be, even if they're not willing to say so, there'll be probably participants here from very different universities to University of Exeter going, is this feasible for our undergraduate body, unless they have an expertise in this already to be able to tutor this subject. So I think, you know, talking to that point, Anne-Marie, a bit more about, or Lee, about the training program that you provided and the ability for sort of other undergraduates and maybe less selective institutions to be able to take this on would be really helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I could speak to that a little bit. I mean, because when we spoke to Lindsay, we were worried about this. I'm a former physics student, by the way. So I was like, okay, I was thinking of my early days and some of my fellow physicists, would they be able to teach basic sentences, you know? And what was really reassuring from Lindsay was that she said, no, if someone does this course, they will be able to write or help tutor in this but I think the emphasis here is a lot of talk about tutoring in a very generic sense, particularly in regards to the National Tutoring Programme. For those of you who don't know that was the government, the government in England's effort to invest in tutoring during the pandemic. The problem with that is huge variation, not only in quality, but in what the tutoring was for. So I think that's why we've been so specific, I suppose, in this is about basic sentences for 12, 13-year-olds, designed in a course, you know, it's very specific and targeted. It's not generic tutoring. So I think that's really important. But no, it was the course that enabled us to do that. And I do worry. I mean, I talk to lots of different universities about tutoring, and I do worry about some of the targeting, I have to say, elsewhere I've seen, and also some of the quality assurance. So those things do not underestimate. But Anne-Marie or Lindsay, you might want to add to that. I don't know.
I mean, the course is written. The course for both the children in the school, but also for the undergraduates, is written with the understanding they have zero knowledge of grammar. And the reason it's called Crafting Accurate Sentences is because there is some grammar in it, of course, because you can't really talk about moving a clause from one place to another if you don't know what a clause is. In the same way, if I asked you to move a table across the room, it would be helpful if you knew what a table was. But we don't really get bogged down in the grammar of it. And so it doesn't feel frightening in that way. And the aim is to literally go from zero knowledge of grammar, like even if you don't know what a noun is, that's not a problem, go all the way through to being able to functionally write sentences. What I would say is that was definitely a fear of the undergraduates, because, you know, like one specific person was a maths graduate, and she was genuinely a bit worried about, like, what if they ask me a question I don't know the answer to? But the school, obviously, we had a member of staff there who is an English teacher anyway, and therefore there's that safety net. But there was no issue, because the course for the children as well is scaffolded in a way that slowly builds their learning up, that it didn't create an issue ever where they didn't know what they were doing, the kids or the adults, the young adults.
Brilliant, thank you. And Lindsay, I wonder if, and you know, Anne-Marie, Lee, I'm sure there are reflections from you on this too, on who, in terms of the school pupils, this benefits the most. There's a question there around Is this more suited to closing gaps for pupils with mid to low prior attainment, or for those with sort of higher prior attainment reaching a higher level than they would anticipate? I don't know if you've got any reflections on that at all.
So from a teaching perspective, this course is specifically designed, I mean, from my perspective, it doesn't have to be year 8s. It is year 8s because that's who we did it with, but it could be any age really at secondary, or indeed even in year 6. But it is designed for children who cannot write accurately, and therefore, by their definition, they would be middle to low prior attainers. However, there are a number of resources, because in Crafting Brilliant Sentences, which is my book, it takes that knowledge, that basic knowledge, and then teaches them how do you use that knowledge to craft beautiful, complex, interesting and engaging sentences. And it's all about crafting. So there could be another program that was designed for high, middle and high prior attainers, but I would argue that it wasn't this course, because this course is how do you get accurate? And then the next step would be how do you craft?
Yeah. Is there any reflections on who this has benefited the most, or is it just the sample size is just too small, I suppose, to really have any strong views on that?
Yeah, this is quite a small pilot. I mean, I suppose, Rich, I would see this very much as part of the civic role of universities in helping, at a time when we're seeing extreme education inequalities, where we have a number of children not even turning up to school, right? At the moment, there are some really profound challenges outside in the education sector. I see this as more of that low middle attaining, rather than, I suppose, a specific access agenda, right? So that was really important for us. And again, we'd have to work with Lindsay if we were going to do something on the high attaining rate. I mean, it might prompt other questions, but for me, it was, and of course, as you all know, universities now have explicit responsibilities for helping raise school attainment, right? We're all being asked to do this now. And so I think this fits into that agenda. But Anne-Marie, I don't know if you would agree with that, but I see it as that agenda more than maybe getting young people to come into the universities per se. Although saying that, I mean, what has been amazing, as Lindsay was saying, some of these young children now are considering university, which was, to be honest, was something wasn't a direct aim, I guess, but looking back on it now, you can sort of see it happening. It's beautiful, by the way, when you go and watch it all, because you can see these relationships, and that's very special, actually. So that was an additional thing, yeah. But I think it's low middle attainers, I would say.
Brilliant. And is there any reflections? I know, Lindsay, you covered this in terms of year 8 pupils, but what was the rationale behind choosing year 8 pupils? I don't know, Anne-Marie, if that's...
Yeah, so just to add to what Lee was just saying there, I guess a part of this came out of a research project that we did that kind of highlighted that children in the Southwest were the furthest behind at the end of both primary and secondary school. And this is disadvantaged pupils, by the way. And I guess that was really our thinking behind sort of targeting, as Lee and Lindsay said, low to mid attainers. In terms of year 8, the thinking behind that is, so obviously we worked on this with Lindsay, and St James is a secondary school. So we thought, earlier intervention evidence is, that's always better. There's quite a lot of things aimed at sort of tutoring aimed at GCSE years, but that's very much about sort of, I guess, giving a boost to those exam results. But we wanted this to actually sort of focus on, I suppose, something that would help students sort of across as much of their, I suppose, secondary school career as possible in all subjects. And that was the reason for year 8s. Year 7, I suppose, could be possible, but I think there's a lot of things happening in year 7 when they, this is autumn term, so this is right when students sort of come back to school. So year 8 made a bit more sense.
Great, yeah, thank you.
It's interesting, Richard. The more just this conversation make reflect, because we've gone for second year undergraduate, so we're basically missing out the first year on both sides, aren't we? We're not doing year 7s and we're not doing first year undergrads, right? But that was just our logic. The other thing that this reminds me of as well, I'd say to everyone, I mean, we've been lucky to have, you know, I sit on the Ted Ragg Trust, right, which is a dynamic trust in our local area. I guess that's given us a strategic partnership, right? Because, you know, that we will talk to, so senior people at the university will talk to senior people at the trust. And I can imagine someone trying to do this with individual schools, that being logistically quite hard. But just, I think that's something people need to consider as well.
Well, I think that's a really important point, because that then feeds into, you know, conversations that universities are having around their civic university agreements. So we've got something like up to 70 universities now that have committed or pledged to develop a civic university agreement, many of whom have now published theirs. And, you know, raising attainment or educational outcomes in the city or in the region is at the heart, it seems to me, and I'm sure Greg will talk to this at the end, just teeing you up, Greg, the vast majority of those agreements. So it feels like to me that this could be a real positive piece of action or project that can come out of those agreements, and it not just links obviously to raising attainment, but it would be interesting your reflections on sort of additional benefits, whether there's any signs that it's encouraging sort of undergraduates into teaching, and a university's role there in terms of supporting its place in terms of a teaching profession and so on.
Yeah, I mean, it's early days on this, and I hope, my fingers crossed, because God, do we need this, right? We need people coming into teaching. But importantly, I think Lindsay was saying this, I think, when we were going through it, you know, it also is important that people could go to schools, and if teaching's not for them, they don't go and they don't go into it, right? So I think this is a nice way of getting a taste of what it's like to be in a school, a classroom. You soon get, Lindsay, you know more than me on this, you get a sense of whether this is for you or not pretty quickly, actually. So I would say the benefit is, yes, we want some people to go into teaching, but also we don't want people to go into teaching for the wrong reasons. You know what I mean? So I think this is a good way of looking at that. So I hope that will be an extra bit, but the numbers are quite small at the moment, Richard.
Yeah, is that what you think, Lindsay, or any reflections on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we've got one of the undergraduates who now has signed up and is next year training to teach, which was exciting. And I think actually with the training provider associated with our trust, which is exciting. Excuse the cutting the bushes outside my window, so sorry about that. And then I think that there's another one who's yet to finish their course, but when they do, their plans are to go on and teach. So there definitely is that through flow. Now, would they have done it otherwise? Possibly. I mean, it's difficult to know, but I do think that people left with a real clear sense of either this is for me and I'm excited about it, or this is not for me, but gosh, I respect teachers, and both of those things for me are a win, right?
Absolutely. And, you know, embedding opportunities to gain skills and work experience in the curriculum, I think is always a positive thing. So there's a question here, Lee and Anne-Marie, around if we're interested in delivering the course in another institution, is that possible? Who do we contact, and what is the ballpark cost for doing this? I don't know if you want to take that on.
Do you want to talk about this, Anne-Marie and Lindsay? I mean, so we've been busy trying to codify this and trying to just, yeah, because basically we all did this through, you know, generosity and our own time, and Lindsay particularly busy head teacher, and so now we're having just to tidy up the sort of things like the legality of it. So yeah, we're using Lindsay's stuff basically, so we just want to make sure that we've got all that sorted. But essentially, I think Anne-Marie and Lindsay, we're nearly there, so that we can essentially give materials to someone else who wants to deliver this. At the moment, I don't know, sorry, this has evolved so organically, Richard, that we haven't even discussed costs and things like that. But remember, the aim of this is to do it at a low cost, right? So we're not, in this particular model, we're talking about not paying the undergraduates where they're getting a degree credit. I think that, Anne-Marie, we're going to need to think about what the cost is to an institution in terms, because there's someone who's going to have to do what you did, right? Coordinate this. So there has to be a bit of someone or someone in a university. And from Lindsay's side, there has to be that, from the school side, there has to be some member of staff who's going to dedicate a bit of time as well to this, right? So there will be those sort of costs.
Yeah, just to clarify, so there's not a cost to the programme. The programme, you know, as mentioned, Lindsay's done this, you know, all off her own back completely for the sort of greater good. So the programme is sort of for free in a sense. And we've kind of created a bunch of sort of supporting materials as well. So things like, you know, information for schools, information for parents and pupils, things like timelines around, you know, sort of delivery and so on. All of that, that sort of package of support for the programme, I suppose, we're kind of offering for free, basically. But as Lee said, we're just tying up the sort of the legal stuff around that. So I think what will happen is that we'll ask sort of people interested in providing the programme to just sign an agreement around that, which is just to say things like they won't charge to use for people to for pupils to receive the programme and things like that, and won't change the programme materials, etc., etc. Yeah, in terms of what it would cost sort of an institution to run this, there's obviously just the resource involved in the organising essentially, and then from the school side as well, there'll be the sort of the organising of things in terms of the school, and a supervisor for running the tutoring sessions, but no cost the actual programme itself.
Brilliant, thank you, Anne-Marie. Now we're shortly coming to a close before I hand over to Greg. So just one more question for the three of you. I just wonder if, given the audience, what's the one take home that you'd like them to have, either around the benefits from doing this or the sort of overcoming the barriers from developing a project like this? So Lee, start with you.
Well, as you know, Richard, I'm very passionate about this. I just think this is a no-brainer for all academic institutions. It's something we should all be doing. You know, the vision, I think, is that on every campus across the country, there should be an option to volunteer as an undergraduate to do this type of tutoring. And I honestly don't see any reason why we can't do that as a sector to contribute to, you know, addressing these incredibly stark gaps in schools. So I would just love to, you know, other people to join in on this, and I just think it'd be a great thing to do.
Brilliant, thank you. And Anne-Marie, from your perspective, from running the project.
Yeah, I think the key things are just around implementation. I guess things are always about implementation, and we're just trying to, I suppose, contribute to sort of guidance and discussion around that. So yeah, we've got sort of some of our experiences written down in our report, which talk about sort of just some of those considerations in terms of how you actually deliver tutoring on the ground.
So read the guide, and we'll make sure that a link for that guide will be shared around to everybody that's participating in this too. And Lindsay, from your perspective, from the school side.
Yeah, I would say download the guide and get going on it. It's not very often you get offered like, this works and it's free, please do it. And I think that if you as universities pick that up and then approach local schools and say, we're happy to tutor your kids for free on this research-led like piece of work that clearly works, the schools are not going to say no. Believe me, we are like scraping around for every penny. We will not say no, so just go on and do it. Like, it's free, like why would you not?
Brilliant. Thank you, Lindsay, and thank you all three of you. It's been absolutely brilliant discussion, and yeah, we're delighted to support that project. It's the outcomes and the project is so positive. So thank you. And over to you, Greg.
Thanks, Richard, and thanks, colleagues, for what has been a really stimulating discussion. I just wanted to put a few points, really, because I think there are just a few headline things that would be really interesting to take away from today. Building on Richard was saying about, as he mentioned, most universities and their civic agreements are looking at this sort of how do universities contribute to improving educational attainment. And I think often we don't really know quite what we're trying to achieve. So lots of universities do things, but actually it's not always obvious what it is we're trying to achieve. And particularly, I think we're not very good at measuring stuff. So I think one of the things that I took away from the discussion today was that focus on something very specific, the intervention was around something very specific, and you had a clear way of measuring and demonstrating that improvement had been made. So I think for me, that was a really important lesson of where universities get involved in things like tutoring, actually being absolutely clear that it's a specific thing we're trying to improve, it's a specific thing that we're working on, and we're going to measure that we actually make a difference. And I think too often in programs that we do like tutoring, it's all a bit too vague, it's unclear what has happened as a result of the intervention, and therefore it's not that motivating for anyone to do it. So I think some of the things about the way that this program's been set up is really clear about what you're trying to achieve and very sustainable. I also like the 4 points that Anne-Marie mentioned about high quality, scalable, affordable and sustainable. And I think for many things that we do as universities in the civic space, those 4 sort of principles are absolutely key. If we can't address those things, then we're probably not doing the right things. And I particularly liked the point about, you know, we're universities, we're here for the long term, and that can make us, you know, attached to things that can be long term and can be sustainable, because we're not going to come and go. And I think sometimes as universities, we struggle to make that long term commitment, but actually we are able to do that, and we need to sometimes be willing to do that, because actually some of these problems need long-term commitment if we're going to solve them. I think my only other observation was it feels like this stuff we really should be disseminating and thinking about how do we get this out to the wider network. So my team and I will have a think about how do we communicate this more widely and really give this the push that it deserves as a really good model of student engagement. So thank you again for colleagues who've shared their experience. I think it's been really exciting, and I love the fact that it's just it's great to have the both the university and the school talking about it, and that's a really good way of showing how we can really work in partnership. And it was just brilliant to hear Lindsay's enthusiasm and energy, and you know how it's really working on the ground for those kids. So that's just brilliant to hear. So thanks very much, everyone, and we'll think about how we disseminate this more widely. So thanks, everyone. Goodbye.